Thanks for joining us here today in the auditorium of the World Bank and also to our online audience. My name is Claire Jones. I work for the Financial Times Alphaville blog as the Global Economy Editor. We are here today to discuss something that anyone who's opened a newspaper or watched a news program on the television will know all about, which is trade. The focus of today's discussion specifically is on global value chains, and I'm now going to introduce our three panelists. So I have to my immediate left Penny Goldberg, who is the chief economist of the World Bank. Next to her, I have Arturo Herrera Gutierrez, the finance minister from Mexico. And to my far left, we have Ville Skinnari, who joins us from Finland, where he is the Minister for Development, Cooperation and Foreign Trade. So, last week, the World Bank published its World Development Report, and the theme of this year's report was Trading for Development in the Age of Global Value Chains. Before we move to the moderation and the event, let me just acknowledge the co-directors who have led this year-long research project. We have Caroline Freund and Edita Matu, both of whom were from the World Bank, and also Paul Antras, who's a professor of economics at Harvard University. Just to remind you all, this event is being live streamed on World Bank Live, not just in English, but in Spanish and French. So we're going to open it up with a discussion with Penny about the report. Now, Penny, as chief economist, why did you decide this year, for the first time since the 1980s, to have this report focus on global value chains?
As you said, there had not been a report on trade in the World Bank since the 90s. So it was, last time a report was written was 30 years ago. And we thought the time was ripe for writing a report on trade, especially since trade had played an important role in growth in the last few decades. The 90s are often characterized as the age of hyper-globalization. So we thought a report on trade was due. And at the same time, trade tensions started escalating. That made a report on trade particularly timely and particularly policy relevant.
Sure. And could you just maybe run through to the audience what exactly are global value chains and just how important are they in terms of global trade?
So global value chains are a specific form of trade. In the old days, countries used to import products to consume these products domestically, or they used to export products so that these products could be consumed in a different country. So this is the notion of traditional trade that most of us have. It turns out what has happened in the last few years, partly because of technological improvements, is firms can take a product, they can break it up into small parts, into components, and then they can trade these components. Take, for example, a car. Rather than producing a car in one country, let's say the United States, and exporting the car to another country, one can break up the car into small parts, components, produce some of these components in a different country, for example, Mexico, and then, or Poland, or the Czech Republic, import these parts back to the United States, assemble the final product in the United States, and then export this product to a different country. And you can do that for many products. You can do it for cars, you can do it for iPhones, you can even do it for textiles, for more traditional products. So this has led to a true explosion in trade, because rather than trading final products, these days we import and export parts and components. So by focusing on global value chains, we are essentially focusing on the component of trade that has become most relevant in today's environment. Approximately 50% of total trade today happens through global value chains.
So 50% is clearly a massive chunk. What sort of benefits do you think this rise in the use of global value chains by big international firms has had for the global economy?
So this was the main question we actually asked in the report. So our main question was, are there benefits to trade still in the current environment? And are there benefits to global value chains specifically that go beyond the benefits of traditional trade? And the answer is yes. The benefits to global value chains are very large, and they go beyond those of traditional trade. And there are two reasons. There are two main reasons for that. The first one is that trade in global value chains is, as we call it, relational. Relational means that it doesn't happen in anonymous markets. It happens between firms that know each other, that have long-term relationships. And what this means is there is much more scope for knowledge transfer, for technology transfer. Your counterpart is not an anonymous party. It's someone you've known for a long time. So precisely because firms trade parts and components, they need to make sure that the parts are compatible, that they meet the quality standards of the other party, that they can be assembled without having any big surprises regarding errors, regarding quality deficiencies, and so on. And so all this facilitates knowledge transfer and quality improvements. So that's one reason we find very strong growth effects. The second reason is that because you break up a product into small components, in principle, it's much easier for developing countries that don't have fully developed capabilities to join global value chains. So if you think of a country that's relatively poor, does not have any capital, does not have any capabilities, it may find it very hard to produce a car. But it might be much easier for this country to produce just a few components and participate in the trading system by exporting these components. So because of that, global value chains make it easier for countries to join and use trade as a means to develop.
There seems to be quite a disconnect between what most economists would agree are these very large benefits from trade and what we're seeing in the public discourse at the moment, where there is a lot of negativity about trade and a retrenchment from trade. Is there any, what would you say? Would you say when you were doing the work on this report, you did identify problems with global value chains? Was it clear to you that there's not just winners here, that there are losers too?
That's absolutely true. So it's a very old message of trade theory and economics more generally, that trade has big benefits to the economy as a whole and to the world as a whole, but there are winners and losers. And just as global value chains magnify the traditional gains from trade, they also magnify distributional conflicts in many ways. So we do document that global value chains may lead to inequalities. There can be inequalities across countries. So some countries are concerned that they may get stuck in producing low value-added components, and they may get stuck, they may get trapped in the middle income trap, as we call it. Within countries, we document that some regions may develop much faster than others. So one example is Mexico. The areas where global value chain is located, in that case, maquilladoras grew much faster than the rest of the country. Vietnam is another example where there was fast growth and poverty reduction in the areas where global value chains are located, but there are big inequalities relative to the rest of the country. So the spatial dimension seems to matter a lot within countries. Another dimension that seems particularly relevant in the context of global value chains is the companies located in advanced countries that participate in these chains become very profitable. And intuitively, this is because they can use global value chains to minimize their costs. You locate your production to those countries that can produce very cheaply. So that allows them to increase their profits. To a certain extent, this is good for consumers in advanced countries. So when we import apparel from East Asia or from Bangladesh, this is good news for consumers in the United States or in Europe because the prices are low. So even though the profits of these firms are large, consumers still benefit. But there is tension often with local suppliers in developing countries, with small and medium-sized enterprises who often feel excluded. They feel they cannot always connect to the bigger firms. And so in the report, actually, we have a series of recommendations about what companies can do and what countries can do to make sure that these gains are more equally shared, and that firms, domestic firms, small firms, can feel that they participate in the gains from trade, and perhaps most importantly, that they can also gain from this knowledge transfer. That's perhaps the biggest benefit of global value chains, is they facilitate the transmission of knowledge. So it's particularly important for the smaller firms to be able to participate in knowledge transfer. In the report, we also talk about the effects on other dimensions of inequality, for example, the effects on women. It turns out global value chains in general are good for women in the sense that they increase female labor force participation, so they tend to employ more women than domestic firms in most developing countries. And they actually provide good jobs, stable jobs in the formal sector. However, we also document that most of these jobs tend to be low-wage jobs, so jobs that require low skill. And so it's a mixed bag, because they do employ more women, but they do not help women advance. We also address the effects that global value chains have on the environment. And again, there the news is mixed. I would say overall global value chains tend to be good for the environment. And the reason for that is the big companies located in advanced countries often push for better standards, better environmental standards, partly because they know that the consumers in their own countries care about better environmental standards. So that's the good news. The bad news is, as you can imagine, when you break up a product into very small parts and you trade back and forth, you create more trade, you create more transport. More transport means higher emissions. And at the same time, there is more packaging. That means more plastic, more waste. So global value chains do worse on these dimensions. But we have a series of recommendations about steps that firms and countries could potentially take to minimize these impacts.
Thanks a lot for that, Penny. I'd now like to turn to Ville. In your career, you worked for Nokia, which gave you a lot of experience of these matters, I imagine, in terms of global value chains. Could you just talk us through how this sort of business practice, where you're crisscrossing Asian and European markets, works?
Good afternoon, everybody, and regards from Ethiopia. I just flew in from Addis Ababa, so forgive me if I look a little bit tired, 16 hours flight. Yes, as said, I have experience in global business as a Finn. I did serve and develop Nokia's service business years back, and I also have worked in Japan for a Japanese trading house, which is another perspective to global trade. The value chains obviously are very diverse. But maybe the most important thing is that you have to understand how the value chains work globally, but also regionally. And therefore, I would like to emphasize the importance of intellectual properties, especially now in the current environment. How you deal with the ownership, how you could and should commercialize intellectual properties, but especially how you respect the IPR as far as legislation, as far as local behavior, and at the global level, obviously, the rules-based system, that how we really see it at the global level. And unfortunately, even in my days, not all countries respected intellectual properties. But in Europe, in Finland, obviously, we do respect that. But also, I think it's important to see, as you said, it's important to see the human capital. And I think that was the strength of Finland, strength of Nokia, that we really emphasized on the educational skills side and human capital side. And we would really work with that at the global level.
Thanks a lot. Arturo, now I'd like to bring you into the discussion. I mean, Mexico is a key element of this, surely. It's often cited as one of the examples of the countries that's really played a significant role in these global value chains, and clearly there's a lot of debate today about what's going to happen with international trade policy in Mexico. So I think we'd all be interested in hearing about your country's experience and some of the policy recommendations that you would make based on that.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. Let me start by mentioning that it's very, very telling that we are having this panel on the very day in which the UK is announcing an exit from the EU, because an important pillar of the development of the global value chain was the fact that man-made barriers to trade were going down, and this has been a trend for decades, which somehow is getting into muddy waters right now. So yes, as you said, Mexico has been a major player in these issues, and Penny mentioned that part of what we are seeing is piggybacking on the liberalization wave, which started in the 90s. And Mexico, around 94, actually signed the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So we were very well positioned to this thing. We are seeing several things that are resulting quite interesting when you see it in retrospective in Mexico. One is that value chains could be much more complex than one could imagine, right? So to make a caricature about it, you say a small piece doing in one country, then moving to another country, then moving to another country, and then finally export. Given that we are obviously very close to the largest market, things become much more complex, and then they add an additional policy complexity. Let me give you a very specific example, and actually I requested from my team this example this morning. So when we export trucks from General Motors, actually we could start with electronic cars that go in the seats. That's assembled in Guadalajara, in the western part of Mexico, right? Then it's sent to a logistic and center that General Motors has in El Paso. They took it there, and then they send it to another factory, which is in the eastern part of Mexico, in Matamoros, very close to the border, and then they put it in a seat. From there, they send it to El Paso back. They change it again, and then they send it to another factory, which is in the middle part of the country, in the state of Mexico, when they put it into the car. And then they finally export the car. But this is what traditionally has been considered an export, right? When the final product goes out. But when that product goes out, actually pieces of it have been crossing the border with the US several times. Now, that illustrates pretty much some of the benefits about this, in the sense that these micro specialties that you have in different places and in completely different places in Mexico have the opportunity to develop to their fullest. But it has a very obvious policy complexity that we were not fully aware. And as you may have seen, and with all the trade tensions everywhere, at some point, one of the tensions materialized was the possibility of having an increase on tariffs on Mexican exports, right? Now, they were talking about 10, 15%. But the fact is that when you consider how global value chains work, it would end up being adding more than 10 or 15%, because it would have first an additional tariff when it will go from Guadalajara to El Paso, then an additional tariff when it will go another 10 or 15% when it go from Matamoros to El Paso, and then a final additional tariff. And when you compose all those tariffs, that could go to those taxes could become really, really, really burdensome. So one of the lessons that we are getting from our own experience is that we need to have pretty stable trade agreements, because otherwise the small changes could have very, very, very different impacts. A second thing, which is related to something that was mentioned by Penny, is that for better or worse, those areas in which you have large global development factories or linked to this are developing faster than the country, right? Clearly the northern part of Mexico, but also the middle part of Mexico. And now that's a strike contrast with what is happening in the southern part of Mexico. So we have a huge regional disparity in Mexico. The GDP per capita of some states in the north could be almost 4 times the GDP per capita of some states in the southern part. But one has to be a little bit more cold-minded when one looks to these issues, because before liberalization, before NAFTA, before global value chains, we already have those kind of disparities. So global value chains are not a silver bullet for development. They are not neither the reason of regional disparities in a country. It could exacerbate it at the margin, and it could exacerbate it importantly, but it's not the cause. And if it's not the cause, the solution does not go through that.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I think it'd be good to stay on the theme of some of the policy aspects of just making global value chains work in a way that's a little bit more fair. And clearly, a big issue that's been brought up by several panelists is inequality. You noted about the issue of like Finland has done a lot to invest in human capital. When I looked at the questions that were being submitted from online from the audience earlier today, a lot of them were focusing on the idea of, well, what can countries do to raise that investment in human capital to lead to it being the case that the sort of the high value added parts of the global value chain can be staying in their own country? I mean, what would you say would be the lessons you take from the Finnish experience on that?
I think one of the key areas of success in Finland is the education, and especially the investment in gender equality. Investing in women, investing in girls, having similar opportunities, and having actually as much women and men in the working life and education, it's something that we have achieved during the last decades, and obviously we're very proud of that. But it obviously comes to the global fact that if we had, say, in the working life as many women as men in the current world, the global GDP could be far higher, even 26%. So educating a girl, educating a woman is a really good investment. And I think in Finland, our government's message is, and that's what we do, that we are investing even more money and at each and every level of education, from the very childhood all the way to the university level, because we see that the education is the key. And that's why also in our development policy, we are focusing on women and girls, people with disabilities. We really want to build up value chains, if you like, also in this area. We want to focus on women entrepreneurship. We want to get from aid to trade, which means that we can really build up real value chains in developing countries. And that's why countries like Finland are now focusing on these areas.
And another area in which there's, I think, some concern, which is very much in the news at the moment, is the impact or the relationship between economic growth and the environment and the environmental costs of growth and of trade. Now, this is something that during your EU presidency in Finland, which you have from the 6 months running to the end of this year, have said there are plans to do things on. So can you just explain what those plans are in terms of mitigating some of the environmental costs of trade?
We have probably one of the most ambitious climate policy in the world. Finland aims to be carbon neutral by 2035. And we have composed roadmaps to each and every segment, from industries to agriculture and so forth. But also at the European Union level, European Union is very committed to achieve these goals. And I think it also comes to the trade agreements. It comes to the way how we compose the modern trade agreements, how we include the sustainable development chapters, and how we can implement and enhance also more efficiently, for instance, the Paris Agreement. I think this is the development Finland is pushing forward, and I believe this is the way European Union is pushing forward. But obviously, we have a lot of challenges when it comes to the global level, and that's why Europe has to take more leadership. Europe has to show that we really lead by example, and that's what Finland wants to do.
And Penny, what would your kind of top 3 points be on how to make trade more inclusive and more sustainable based on compiling this report and doing so much research on the topic?
So I could talk about this for hours, but just briefly. The concern about the unequal effects of trade and globalization tends to be more pronounced in advanced countries for obvious reasons. So there is a lot that the advanced countries could do to address these concerns. It's not, we did not view that as the mission of the report, to provide advice to advanced countries, but any policies that address inequalities in advanced countries indirectly benefit developing countries because they diminish the backlash that we're experiencing right now. And there are many such policies. These are policies, for the most part, domestic in nature, so they're really up to the countries to specific countries to implement those. From the point of view of developing countries, there is a lot they can do at this point. Most of them, many low-income countries are still at the beginning of their development process. And it's very often the case that when countries are at this stage, they prioritize growth. And moreover, they think there is a trade-off between growth and inequality. So they focus on growth and they forget about inequality. So one point that we make in the report is, number one, you should care about inequality. Because, as we see from advanced countries, eventually it can become an obstacle to growth. Eventually, there's going to be backlash against policies that promote growth. So this is something you should worry about at the outset. It should not be an afterthought. And also because when you have an equal society, everyone gets an opportunity to participate. By equal, we don't mean that everyone has exactly the same. We just mean a society when everyone has an opportunity, an equal opportunity to participate. This is good for growth. So developing countries should take steps to make sure that everyone has an opportunity. How exactly they accomplish that, that is going to be up to each country. It depends on the realities on the ground. So this is the first point, that you should care about it. Second, in many developing countries, there is still a big difference in the way men and women are treated. This is not specific to global value chains. This has to do with many reasons, many factors in these countries. Addressing gender inequality is a second priority in many developing countries. And third, we also make the point in the report that we're at a point in time where we should worry about climate change. Climate change is very likely to affect developing countries even more than it affects advanced countries. Trade is not the primary driver of negative effects on the environment, but it can have negative effects, as I mentioned earlier, through increased transport, through increased packaging. We should take steps to make sure that these adverse effects are minimized. In the report, we have a series of specific steps that one could take. They range from macro policies, carbon taxes, for example, to very specific interventions that could help, small steps that could go a long way towards helping private-public partnerships that can incentivize firms to engage in green initiatives that can have positive effects.
Okay. And I'd like to touch on a point, Arturo, that you mentioned in your opening remarks, and in terms of, I think, in improving the outcomes for developing countries. I think this is an important aspect. And the sense I got from you is that where Mexico has really benefited is there are now a lot of firms with these unique niche specializations. So what would you recommend to other countries to do in terms of encouraging that investment in new technologies and really leading to more growth and leading to more value-added activity in the economy?
Thank you for the question. And if I may want to try to connect it to one of the points made by Penny when she said that one of the things that people need to do is to make sure that there are opportunities for everybody. But what those opportunities for everybody mean specifically in policy terms is slightly trickier than what it means. So let me give you an example. One of the less developed areas in Mexico is the state of Oaxaca. The state of Oaxaca is probably closer to Texas in a straight line, to the southern part of Texas, than Texas is, let's say, to the state of Washington or Oregon. So the geographical location, the assets is there, right? What is not there is, first of all, is the infrastructure. So it's easier for firms that are located in the border to be there. It's easier for firms that are in the middle of country to get there. But for some areas which are relatively more remote, you have to create the right infrastructure so that products come move fast. So some of the issues related to this are not exclusively about trade, are about infrastructure, right? So we shouldn't look to the trade issue only with the lenses of trade. There are more complexities. Another issue related is that one of the things that it operates really well in the way in which global value chains are organized is that there's some, especially some sort of learning by doing or in-job training for the people who work on several parts of the border in regards to that. And that's very important because, as Penny mentioned, this brings the quality and the standards to a certain level. But while that may be true when it's operating, the initial conditions may be different. So very often, and clearly in a country like Mexico, you may have a mismatch of skills between what is required by a firm and the skills that are required, that the supply of labor that the workers have. So it may be necessary to bridge that gap to some sort of trainees program, in the job program. This is one thing in which you are really concerned, trying to close that gap.
So is that something that you've done a lot? Do you have a constant dialogue with foreign firms where they say we're struggling to get these sorts of workers, and then you then think about up and training? I mean, how does that work in practice in your?
Well, it works in two different ways. The first one is what you mentioned. Firms are actually doing what they do, but the problem is wider than the scope of the specific firms. I mean, in a country like Mexico, when you have 56 million people in the labor force, that goes beyond the specific firms. So part of that has to be done by the government. And this is not something new, and we are actually having a new program which is working on that. But it's not something new. That's what has been done several times in Europe, particularly in Germany. What is new is the scaling which we are trying, and we are trying. I mean, we will see what the results are. But there are a few interesting surprises with this new program, and this is a program that just have a few months that tries to create a bridge in this skills mismatch. One is that the demand for people who wanted to enroll is larger than what is expected. But the demand for women to enroll in the program was much larger than we thought. So actually, in the trainees program, there are, and this is around 1 million people there are 58% are females. So that means that only 42% are males. That means that there you have 33% more female being trained in the job with respect to males. In a country in which we have a very low female labor participation, this is very important.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I think it's now important as well to look ahead to the future. Clearly, this is another aspect of the public debate. We're not just talking about trade and the environment all the time. We're also talking about technology, a lot of digitalisation of the economy. I'd like to know what our panellists think about how that fits into the story on trade and global value chains. Ville, what's your initial thoughts on this? How will the strands that you're seeing in digitalisation at the moment and other aspects of new technologies really fit into this very broad story about global trade?
Digitalisation in general provides huge opportunities for trade, for business, and also if we look at the global level, and I just got back from Africa, from Ethiopia, I really see that how already now, for instance, in Africa, like in a country like Kenya, let's say the mobile payment systems are really going further very fast. E-commerce itself, we see the success stories. So I think it's important to really see also the local development, but also the regional development. And I'm very convinced that, for instance, after meeting with the Ethiopian Prime Minister, the Nobel Prize receiver actually, he was very impressive person with his commitment, how he is willing and actually doing practical reforms and also seeing the regional economic integration as an important tool also for peace, but also for economic integration and people's benefit. So definitely digitalization itself, how we see the future, I think Africa is going to be one of the key continents, and for instance Finland is now starting to compose Africa strategy, which is going to be very comprehensive, also including digital opportunities, and so is European Union, which is to work on the Africa strategy. But obviously when we talk about digitalization, as far as legislation, it's quite a complex area for legislators, lawmakers like myself, and we have to see also that how we can create platforms, better platforms, for instance within Europe, how we can guarantee the rights of the consumers, and how we can guarantee the money flows and interactions in a better way. But all in all, I see very positive opportunities when it comes to digitalization, e-commerce, especially in the developing countries.
So let me start by saying that one of the most surprising findings of the report, or of our work, was that new technologies and automation are actually good news for trade. And that may come to many as a surprise. When we started working on this report, we were committed to providing an objective assessment of global value chains and trade. We did not want to be the cheerleaders of trade. And one of the main concerns that people express these days is with increased automation, with robots coming, perhaps there is no more scope for trade, and especially with developing countries. The reason many firms went to Bangladesh or Vietnam or Mexico was because they were trying to take advantage of the cheap labor that's available in these countries. But if you're going to use robots, why search for cheap labor? So this has been the thinking for a while. And there are many who have claimed that because of automation, because of robots, there will be no scope for trade with developing countries anymore. So we did look into this question. That was actually one of the questions that motivated this report, because we wanted to know, should we be advising countries, developing countries, to try to do everything they can to participate in trade if they're going to be shut out anyway because of new technologies? So it turns out that this intuition is not borne out by the data. And why is that? The reason is simply that there is a scale effect, there is a productivity effect. So the firms that adopt these new technologies, that adopt robots, are productive firms. They tend to do very well. They increase production, as they increase production, they need even more parts and components, and these parts and components still come from the developing world. And it's perhaps interesting to note that the one industry in which that uses the most robots, that's the automobile industry, actually. So if you look at pictures of what the assembly line looks in an automobile factory these days, it's full of robots. Still, in the automobile sector, trade between developed and developing countries has increased dramatically in the last 15 years. So our work shows that very clearly. We have other case studies in the report. There is a very interesting case study of hearing aid, and hearing aid switched completely to 3D printing. And again, the expectation was that 3D printing would lead to massive reshoring, so countries would stop engaging in trade. We find evidence of exactly the opposite happening. Trade increases in hearing aid. And again, what drives all this is the scale effect. Companies become more profitable, they expand their operations, and that's good news for trade with developing countries. So this concern is so far has not been borne out by the data at all.
I mean, I think you touch on a very interesting issue that I'd just like to pick up on there, which is that the political debate is really focused on this idea that what trade leads to is jobs deserting economies, whereas what you're saying now is that in a lot of sort of advanced economies, if you go around a factory, there aren't that many jobs there anyway. There's a lot of robots in the car plant in the US. Do you think it might be the case that even if you saw a retrenchment from trade, that if there was more onshoring, would that likely not lead to the rise in manufacturing jobs that the political discourse maybe suggests that it would?
So this is actually a question very closely related to the World Development Report of last year that specifically looked at what happens to jobs, so the new phase of work. And it's interesting that last year's report documents that new technologies have not affected jobs worldwide. They have led to a decline of jobs in high-income countries, but they've led to an increase in jobs in developing countries. And interestingly, in some parts of the world, East Asia, for example, even in advanced countries, even in Japan, they have led to an increase in jobs. And what accounts for that? In many advanced countries, we have a big demographic problem. We have aging population. So many people in Japan will tell us, we actually need robots because we don't have people to do the work that we need to have done. So part of the reason we have not seen these dramatic effects that many have predicted is precisely because the robots in many countries are coming in response to a labor deficit. So far, all these dramatic predictions have not materialized. I'm always careful about extrapolating from the past to the future, but I think one needs to be careful to make these extremely gloomy predictions about what the future of work looks like.
I'd like to stay on the theme of the political climate just because we've got Arturo with us here, and you've really been at the coal face of some of the big trade discussions, and the tensions have clearly really engulfed Mexico as well. So what is your sense of how things feel at the moment, and what's your sense of what the economic implications of this are going to be if the current climate continues as it is?
Well, first of all, one of the first things that we need to do is to talk about it, right? And that may seem pretty obvious, but before being minister, I was vice minister, and in that capacity, I went to the G20 meetings. I'm really glad that I'm not a vice minister anymore. That vice ministers are the ones who do the heavy lifting. And when we were working on the communique for the last G20 meeting, there was a 5-line paragraph related to trade tensions. It took 18 hours to reach an agreement on that. And that illustrates what is happening, right? So basically, I'm not going to name names, but I'm sure you could figure out who were there. There was one country which didn't want that trade tensions were mentioned a lot on the communique. There were other countries which said that the trade tensions were not only a risk, but they were already having an impact in the economy. So the fact that we are able, the first step to solve a problem is to acknowledge that we have a problem. Now, trade issues, as it was implied here, have several impacts, including they intertwine very much with politics. And we are in the middle of several major election processes in the world, including the US. And it's interesting how people perceive that. So Penny alluded to 2 or 3 things that I think are very important. One is, let's say, the digital revolution that you mentioned. It increased productivity, but productivity, or labor productivity, by definition, means that with less workers you produce more. So yes, it's good for the economy, but you require less workers. But another way to do it is that as labor productivity raises, the wages also raise. So a big part of this, and very important, is that this opens the possibility of people to increase these wages. And the other thing that we have to be careful, and that's why we need to be explained, is that some of the issues related to trade, related to the digital economy, are creating some concerns that probably, if we will see artificial intelligence, etc., these are not new concerns, right? Around 200 years ago in England, Ned Ludd was leading a movement that was advocating for finishing the machines because the jobs for the workers will be finished. We should be glad that we have these productivity shocks, but we should be able to react to what some misplacements at the micro level could happen. There's a very, very important article by David Autor and some of his workers that they see that trade, in particular with China, does not necessarily have meant that overall at the aggregate level jobs have been lost in the US, but a very specific at the individual level, some of the people who lost their jobs because they moved to China were unable to recover a similar job in a long time.
Thank you. And clearly the issues are not just about the US, there's also the issue that today is a big day for Brexit too. So Ville, would it be possible to get an EU or Finnish perspective on what the authorities there are doing really to keep trade open and to show people really that, you know, that it matters to keep open, because I think there is this disconnect, if you like, where everyone knows that, well, I think people would see trade as being a good thing. I mean, I think there's been a lot of low inflation and fall in prices, so people have been able to consume a lot more from global trade because it's made things cheaper, but to the same degree the losses are very pronounced in the sense of if you're in a town and a factory shuts, it's very visible and it's a very emotive thing, which the gains of trade are maybe not so much for the everyday consumer. So what you do as a policymaker to really keep borders open and show, what message do you give to show why it's important?
Finland is committed to work on and improve the rules-based system, rules-based world order. And the reason is very simple. We have seen from the history that people benefit, companies benefit. It is also a win-win situation for the very poorest countries. Actually, it's not a cliché that Finland lives from exports, imports and innovations. Since Finland received development aid in 1960s, and now Finland is one of the richest countries. Free trade agreements, but of course also corporate responsibility and especially government responsibility is the key that we can have a sustainable growth and also sustainable working life. But obviously there is great turbulence at this stage in the world when it comes to trade. And it's obvious that we are to maintain, and we want to maintain, positive trade agenda with the United States. We want to emphasize the importance of rules-based system. But it's also obvious that Finland and the EU is ready to defend its own interest if and when necessary. But once again, in line with WTO rules. So I think we need dialogue. We really need dialogue at the global level, but also at the regional level to build up a better world in that sense. But I'm very delighted, as I said earlier, about the commitment in Africa, and especially after discussing with my colleagues in Ethiopia, that having this kind of regional commitment and even more in the future, having further free trade area in Africa, I think it's feasible, and it's very important that we share the mutual vision also at the global level.
Okay. Thanks a lot for that. I'd like to turn to the audience now and ask if there's anyone out there who wants to pose questions. But if we could begin with Antti Kahunen from the European Commission. Could we also have a show of hands from people who'd like the mic to be passed to them next, if there's anyone else out there? But Antti, please begin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the distinguished panel for excellent insights, and congratulations for the World Bank Group for this excellent report on global value chains. The European Commission agrees that global value chains can boost jobs and growth and reduce poverty, but it's only possible if there's a willingness to make the necessary reforms in our partner countries, and if the industrialized countries indeed have open and predictable policies. Otherwise, investment just will not take place, and it's difficult to expand the global value chains. It is worrying to see the stagnation, as is witnessed by the report, since 2008, and protectionism and weakening of the international trade system risks making things worse. 3 remarks. First, the international support is really needed to accelerate developing countries' participation in these value chains. The EU stands for free trade, a multilateral rules-based system, as has been said by the Minister of Finland. And we pursue this through our trade agreements and our trade regimes, and also with our aid for trade, which amounted to some 14.7 billion euros in 2017. Our partners, if they are fully to benefit from global value chains, they need to have a lot of ownership and focus on the reforms, on investment climate, on trade facilitation, and on trade policies. And also, not least, there is a huge need and promise in economic regional integration. So, for example, processes like the Continental Africa Free Trade Area is something that the European Union strongly supports, and we have key tools like our external investment plan to support that. Second small point, sustainability along the value chains is really something that must be ensured. This is about social aspects, but it's also about decent work, addressing inequalities, and it covers the environmental sustainability. In the coming years, we will be focusing on something that we call the Green Deal for Europe. With the SDGs as a compass, we will fight climate change, CO2 emissions, we will promote green and circular economy, and this is also about sustainability at the core of the business strategies, so responsible business conduct and due diligence with the right mix of mandatory and voluntary mechanisms is needed. My final point is that we really welcome the attention of the report on the challenges faced by women and in participating in this value chains. We would even like to emphasize this point more. We really need to identify and address the impediments that today we have in standing in the way of women's economic empowerment. This means addressing the legal and policy constraints and, for example, ensuring that girls are not left behind in digital skills, in training, education, and we must pursue women entrepreneurship, support women in managerial roles and help them in access to finance. And it means also about, working on decent wages and working conditions. And we just want to assure that the European Commission, will stand with the partners to support all of these goals. Thank you very much, and once more, congratulations for this excellent report.
Thank you. Before we turn to the panel for a response, could I just ask the mic to be passed to the woman in the fourth row, please? Sorry. Thank you. And can you just introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Hello. My name is Naseem. I'm an undergrad at Yale. Okay, so Mr. Scanari, recently I heard that you just mentioned that in the 1960s, Finland received capital transfers, and because of that, I don't know if you meant it as a correlation or a causation, but you said that they're one of the richest countries in the world now. So based on the recent research that has come about regarding the impact of capital transfers on sustainable development economy, do you still, such as a solid growth model, for instance, do you see capital transfers as a way to increase the stable state or the permanent, the economic state of developing nations, or are there other factors that could increase total factor productivity, whether that be global value chains or other possible mediums?
Thanks a lot. Do you want to take the two questions first, and then we'll move along? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Very good question. Unfortunately, I don't have all the statistics, but at the general level, I can say that after the Second World War, yes, Finland received development aid until 1960s. But since we also invested into the education, social and healthcare system and so forth, we were able to build up apart from the local ecosystem, more international, regional ecosystem. And since 1995, since Finland joined the EU, we could really be part of the regional ecosystem called the European Union. Actually, at this stage, from our exports, 60% go to the European Union region. So with this, I want to emphasize the importance of the development phase from aid to trade, what's needed in order to enable this kind of phenomena. I think Finnish learnings are pretty good when it comes to that, but also to understand the importance of regional ecosystems like European Union, why it is so important and why we want to emphasize the importance of the EU.
Thank you. Arturo, would you like to comment on the remarks from the audience and maybe present us with your final thoughts on the discussion?
And, there's one topic which was related with one of the previous interventions, and I have to say, hopefully it doesn't sound arrogant as a comment by the only non-European in the panel to comment on that. But I think we have somehow sidestepped one very, very relevant issue related to trade. And when we were alluding to Brexit and the European Union, if we go back in history, the European Union inherited from the European community and then from the Carbon Union. And the Carbon Union, it was not only about trade. It was about creating cohesion, to avoid quarrels, to avoid conflict. And one of the very, very good aspects, if we think in that way about trade, is that if the countries have the ability to sit at the table and reach an agreement to build something, there are less chances that they are not sitting on a table and are picking up a fight.
Penny.
Yeah, so first, I fully agree with the points you made regarding the priorities of the European Commission. In the report, we emphasize that for the current trading system to work, we need rules. We need to respect the rules-based system. Because global value chains cannot flourish unless we have a predictable environment. As Arturo pointed out before, any trade policy distortion, any trade barrier you impose, any increase in tariff, however small, if you're in a global value chain where goods cross borders multiple times, this is going to have a cascading effect. The effects are going to be much larger in a global value chains than in a standard trade. But beyond that, as you pointed out, global value chains require big investments. They involve sunk costs. So companies go to other countries. They need to learn a lot about these other countries before they invest, and they make these investments. They're not going to undertake these investments unless they have some certainty about the future. And when they're faced with constant uncertainty, they're not going to make these investments. Investment is important for every country, but it's particularly important for developing countries. So when you deprive developing countries of investment, you really cut their lifeline. We make a very strong case for trade rules because that's actually the biggest benefit of trade agreements and the rules-based system. It's not just the tariffs, it's not just the reduction of trade barriers, it's providing a predictable environment. So we absolutely agree with that. Regarding the question about capital transfers, so many of the policies are not are complementary. They are not to the exclusion of others. So, for example, what does it take for a country to successfully participate in a global value chains? There are many factors that contribute to that. But if a country does not have capital, and many developing countries do not have capital, foreign direct investment, inflows of capital are going to be particularly important. So capital inflows are important not only as a precondition for development, they're important also as a precondition for global value chains. So many of these policies are reinforce each other.
Thanks a lot for that. We're now out of time. I'd like to just close by thanking the panelists. I think what's been the strength about the discussion today for me is it's not just been about global value chains and trade, but how these issues fit into the bigger issues of the day, such as technology, such as gender, and such as the environment. I feel like I've learned an awful lot, so thanks a lot to the three of you, and thanks a lot to the audience. I hope you enjoy the rest of the annual meetings.